All right, guys, this is Normal Central coming back at you on the YouTube video, and I am by myself today, but I appreciate all the love and support so far. That Florida State football content that I have published out, man, it's been a great time. Florida State football is now 2 Saturdays away as they play New Mexico State at 7 o'clock Eastern Time in Doak Campbell Stadium. I'm super excited to see where Florida State kind of ends up with their defense, with their offense, kind of seeing how the depth chart plays out. And there's a lot of excitement in Tallahassee right now. I understand the fan base is kind of cautiously optimistic because of the Mike Norvell situation the last couple of years, specifically the last two, where they've only won 7 games. But I do think Florida State has a really good chance to be successful. But I do have some questions. We had talked recently about some guys that were rising up after fall camp and some guys that I thought that could really be a factor in what Florida State brings to the table this year. But I want to talk about something that's kind of worrisome. And on the defensive side of the ball, I think the one worrisome thing that I really, really, really worry about is rush defense. Even though Florida State finished 51st in the country, had about 138 yards they allowed per game rushing the ball. Jaden Baugh last year for Florida, I mean, it was a lifeless Florida 3-8 team. You know, you went to the swamp. I know is a harsh environment for most teams, but the problem is Jaden Baugh had over 225 yards. That is inexcusable, and it doesn't need to be a thing that Florida State football needs to hang their hat on. And I know, I understand. You have a guy like Daryl Jackson, who you lost last year going out of graduation. You know, he's in the NFL now at this point. 6'5", 337-pound defensive tackle that was basically clogging up the middle. I'm not saying he was something spectacular, but, 25 tackles, a couple tackles for loss, like 3 sacks. It's a guy that's massive up in the middle of the field. And, obviously he's taking up a lot of double teams, allowing the linebackers to come up in space. And Florida State desperately needs that this year because you got a guy like Chris Jones, who I think is a very capable linebacker. They really like what they see from Omar Graham, other returning veterans like Blake Nicholson, talented freshmen like Isaiah Williams. And then you got Caleb Valley, who I think is kind of that wild card that could possibly be a starter or at least a great reserve for you if he stays healthy. But the problem is on the defensive tackle side of things, you don't really know what Mandrell is. Desir, he could be a defensive tackle, could be a defensive end. He's kind of a hybrid role. You look at a Daniel Lyons. They talk about a veteran who's a redshirt senior at this point, and he talked about it before. He's a Nole. He's been here for years. And you want to see that guy kind of step up. But the problem is, over the last couple of years, he's been nothing more than maybe a reserve or a fringe starter. Nothing special. You want to see more out of him, and he's taken that leadership role this offseason. We'll see if that translates. Then you got Deontay McCray, who's actually elevated his weight a little bit more. He's at 291 or 292 now, Mike Norvell was talking about. He's a defensive end slash defensive tackle that came from Western Kentucky. I think he could be another guy that you could step up and kind of have that factored into what Florida State brings to the table. A Kevin Wynn, who I think is a sophomore, they really paid a lot to keep him in Tallahassee. He entered the transfer portal and he kind of come out and was able to kind of come back to Florida State. You haven't heard much from the coaching staff. You thought that the guy was going to take the next step like an Usman Kroma, year one to year two. Wynn actually got hurt last year and only played in 4 games because of the redshirt rule. But now that the 5-for-5 happens, now you have a little more frequency there. Jordan Sanders, a reserve from Texas State, who they like. He's a unit, but it's like, man, are you really trusting the guy from Texas State that only had 12 tackles last year, that only had like 1 sack or 2 sacks? I mean, it's kind of a thing that you're worried about with Florida State. The depth there, those 5 guys, are they enough to keep it all together? Will some guys just step up there? It's kind of weird because you have about 5 or 6 defensive tackles that you like, but it's like, how are you going to factor in everything? Is Mandrell going to stay at the defensive end? Is he going to go to more tackle? Is it going to be a hybrid role? Is Kevin Wynn going to be able to step up this year? Because I think you got to have it from him. I mean, Daniel Lyons, you know what you have to have. You've seen him as a reserve role and more of this fringe starter, but can he be that guy that elevates your whole defense? Because I think that's going to be the factor of the whole defense as a whole. If you're not able to stop the run early and make teams basically get in those pass heavy and obvious passing situations, I mean, it's the sky's the limit for this team. The secondary is very talented. I think there are some capable linebackers, but your linebackers can only do so much if your defensive line is not really being able to do anything. Being able to create any kind of pressure at the point of attack. I just wonder what's going to happen with Florida State and how they do because their trenches are going to be so important. We talk about the offensive line all the time, having to replace five starters. You're bringing in an Andre Otto who is a returnee that you hope you're going to have a little bit more from. Xavier Chaplin. All those guys like that. You're bringing in four transfers that are probably going to be your starters plus maybe a returnee type of guy. But it's the same thing on the defensive line. What are you going to be able to do there? You have a Daniel Lyons who's returnee. You have a Mandrell Desir. You have a Daryl Desir that's going to play more defensive end. Rylan Kennedy, Jalen Anderson. The list goes on and on. It's not just about the defensive tackles, but I think Daniel Lyons, with him being able to step up this season, is probably the most important aspect you're going to have to watch this year because the coaching staff can't have any more sunshine pumping to what Florida State wants to be able to do this season. You can't tell me that a player is going to be able to emerge and step up as a leader and then he has 15 tackles on the year and maybe two sacks. That's not going to cut it at a school like Florida State. And we have to get back to those standards of being able to want to win heavier games. I understand Florida State's not really been productive the last 2 years. Heck, 4 out of the last 6, they've not been productive in this coaching staff's regime. But I wonder how everything's going to factor into it because I want Florida State to be successful. I don't want to hear this 6-6 talk. I don't want to hear this 7-5 talk because that's not Florida State. That's not who Florida State is. That's not what we all grew up and enjoyed watching, even in the early 90s. Going to now, Florida State should never be satisfied with a 6-6 or 7-5 season. Obviously, I don't think the roster is as talented to get to a playoff spot. I don't want to put a ceiling on this team, obviously. But I do think that there is a lot of unproven guys, specifically at the defensive tackle spot, that you need to see more from. So I think this is going to be a big aspect of what Tony White wants to do in his defense. Obviously, you want to see that back half of the defense, specifically those three safety sets and then the two corners, being able to be modeled for his defensive scheme and being able to have more productivity that you saw from that Alabama game where they played their hair on fire at this point. But I do think that Florida State's going to have a remarkable year. Tony White has historically been from Syracuse to Nebraska. That year one to year two jump is going to be massive for Florida State and being able to get back on top and where they want to get to, specifically even competing for an ACC championship, something Miami has never really seen. You want to see a lot of things from Florida State, specifically on the defense side of the football, and I'm super excited to see what they can do in this Tony White defense. But let me know your thoughts down below. Are you believing in the Daniel Lyons preseason hype? Do you want to see more from a Kevin Wynn, a Jordan Sanders, even guys like that, a Mandrell Desir, who's probably going to have a lot of double teams this year? What do you think about that defensive tackle room? Do you think that's the most important? What do you think is the most important with everything? Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts. I'm going to be doing this all year. I want to make sure to have as much discussion in the comments as I possibly can. I've got my website kind of coming together as I get it out pretty soon on my social media accounts. Follow me on Norvell Central on Instagram, on Twitter. Follow me on Central Norvell, and then I also have Facebook and TikTok as well. I'm trying to get out as much Florida State content as I possibly can. We are 2 Saturdays away, and I'm super excited for Florida State football this year, and I hope you are too. And I appreciate everybody, and I hope each and every one of you have a blessed Saturday. And as always, go Noles.